Hi guys, welcome back to Nairobi Legal Insights. In our video today, we're going to be looking at termination of employment, and the main objective will be to look at what process constitutes unfair termination from employment within the meaning of the Employment Act of Kenya 2007. In every case of termination of employment, the court looks at the reasons that the employer relied on to terminate an employee's contract and also the procedure that was followed. Now, once the procedure has not been followed, or if there are no viable reason or valid reasons that can be given for termination of an employee's contract, then that termination is considered to be unfair and unlawful within the meaning of the Employment Act of Kenya 2007. When it comes to the reasons that an employer can rely on to terminate an employee's contract, I want us to first appreciate that according to Section 43 of the Employment Act of Kenya, should the employer fail to actually provide a reason why they terminated an employee's contract, then that termination of employment will be considered unfair within the meaning of Section 45 of the Employment Act of Kenya 2007. Remember also Section 45 provides for the threshold for termination, meaning that should the employer fail to meet the threshold under Section 45, then termination of an employee's contract will be considered unlawful and unfair. Also remember that these reasons that the employer relies on to terminate an employee's contract must actually be genuine reasons that exist, and this is going to become clearer in the course of this particular video. When I talk about the threshold for termination of employment, what I mean is that there are certain minimum requirements that must actually be met by the employer before terminating an employee's contract. Now, one of these requirements is that the employer must actually have a valid reason for terminating an employee's contract, and some of the reasons according to the Employment Act of Kenya, specifically under Section 45(2), could be related to the conduct of the employee or even their capacity to perform a particular job. The next thing we need to look at is that over and above these reasons, the employer must actually follow due process as far as termination is concerned. And in our next part of this video, we're going to be looking at what constitutes due process before termination of an employee's contract based on their conduct or even capacity to perform a particular job. Some of the reasons that could result into termination of an employee's contract of employment could be misconduct at the workplace, poor performance, or even the physical incapacity to perform a particular job. So, even with these valid reasons, remember that due process must be followed in handling such cases. An example here would be that if an employee is going to be sacked based on misconduct, maybe that particular employee shows up at work drunk all the time, then in that case, even with that valid reason of misconduct, due process must be followed. And by due process, what I mean is that an employee must actually be given notification, and they must be given a fair hearing before termination on grounds of misconduct. Now, one thing we need to appreciate as students of labor law is that where there is no evidence that an employee was actually ever afforded an opportunity to defend himself as required under Section 41 of the Employment Act of Kenya, then in that case, termination of his or her employment becomes unfair for want of due process. So remember, over and above the reasons for termination, due process must be followed. And just to put this into context, you can't sack an employee simply because maybe they're misbehaving at work by just sending them an email and telling them never come back to work. In that case, that is termed as unfair termination because due process has not been followed. That employee must be afforded a fair hearing. And one thing you need again to remember is that employees have a legitimate expectation to be given an opportunity to be heard before any further action is actually taken against them. In light of the previous discussion, I want us to have an overview of the employer-employee relationship to show you that employees tend to have an upper hand when it comes to the employer-employee relationship. So, putting this into context, While an employer has to give notice with reasons for terminating an employee's contract of employment, like we've stated earlier, when it comes to employees, all they have to give is notice without reasons before leaving that specific employer. Now, to give you an example, if Rogers works for company X and Rogers finds a new opportunity, what is required of Rogers is to simply give notice to company X that he is actually leaving. Rogers in this case is not required to give any reasons why he is leaving. Now, when we turn tables on the other side of the employer, if company X wants to get rid of Rogers, maybe they've found someone who can do a better job, it will not be easy for that company to get rid of Rogers, because over and above giving notice to Rogers, they must actually give a reason, for terminating Rogers' contract of employment, and that reason must be fair and valid. So you can already see that it is so hard for an employer to get rid of his employee, while an employee can easily leave his employer at any time. And so this goes to show you that employees tend to have an upper position in this relationship. Now, even with this existing, employers find ways to overcome this challenge. And remember that no employer wants to be tied to an employee for a long period of time. And so to avoid some of these situations, employers will end up giving their employees fixed-term contracts, or they're going to give out short-term contracts so that it is actually easy for them to dispose of their workers. And so there's some sort of a power imbalance that exists as far as the employer-employee relationship is concerned within the meaning of the Employment Act of Kenya 2007. In our next video, we're going to be discussing about summary dismissal and also expounding on the process of termination within the meaning of the Employment Act of Kenya 2007. And should you be a student watching this content for the first time, consider subscribing so that you receive notifications every single time we post a video on labor law in Kenya. And also don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you liked its content. Thank you.